So thank you for having me and for inviting me out. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I'll be talking about applications of data-driven methods for studying dynamic processes. And so I put applications right in the title because I didn't want to scare people off. I know that this is a mix of quant and non-quant people. So it's going to be mainly focused on the types of models that we've been developing, myself and my colleagues, and as well as people in my lab, and then applying them to study human processes, which, much like Jason said, is kind of the focus of my work. And so I try to attend to individual level nuances in processes, and it comes a little bit from a clinical perspective. I started as a therapist, and I realized that everybody has different triggers, and you have to learn a person across time. And so then when I started to do more research, I realized that we are always studying processes. When we are doing research, even if it's cross-sectional research, we tend to say stuff that suggests time. So for instance, depression and anxiety tend to co-occur. We might say that that's across people, but we're still looking at a snapshot in time, and we're saying that they co-occur in this moment. Self-reported early childhood trauma relates to later symptoms. Like a lot of our theories and a lot of the ways that we think about psychological processes already have time embedded into the way that we talk about it. And so what my work is doing is trying to match this up a little bit more with what clinicians are learning about their clients across time. So for instance, if I'm getting measures of negative affect and stress across time, I could see if maybe those two things are related for my client or the person whose data I have, and then maybe that might help us figure out some sort of intervention if we see that as stress goes up, their negative affect goes up. For some individuals, that might not exist. So I'm trying to parse apart which relations exist for which individuals, so then we can kind of better attune to personalized treatment and things to that nature. So the goal of my work is to bridge these two lines of studies so that the research findings better align with what clinicians are learning. Fisher and Boswell wrote, Aaron Fisher wrote a really nice paper on this, kind of how we can use these data-driven quantitative methods to inform clinical work. I also do a lot of, as Jason mentioned, a lot of work with physiological data, and that has been great. So this talk has both of these elements into it. I'm going to present some MRI data, but I tried to not have it be all MRI data because I know that most people in here are not neuroimagers. So I do have a few daily diary examples as well. And so they'll be interspersed here and there. When I do present the neuroimaging examples, it's mainly to present the model. And you can swap out any of the nodes or any of the variables you see for any variables of interest for you, for instance. So if I'm talking about the prefrontal cortex and how it relates to the cerebellum, that could also be stress and how it relates to positive affect, right? These are just variables. We can swap them out. To me, it's just a matrix with numbers. So you bring the meaning behind it. So what kind of data am I talking about? Time series data, I know some of you all collect this, such as trace data obtained from the internet behaviors. I'm working on looking at learning management system data, for instance, to see how students interact with that platform. Self-response, such as they get prompted on their phone or on an iPad, and they respond to a questionnaire. And then activity data obtained from smartphones, wearable technology, and things like that. Psychophysiological data, what I mean by that could be anything from functional MRI data or EEG, that's also a psychophysiological response, or things like heart rate. I've done some work on heart rate variability. I won't talk too much about that, or really at all about that today, because it's kind of a secondary thing to my main line of research. But so now we're getting this data is kind of the point of this slide, is that we are now having access to watching people across time in a way that we never have before. So this is what the data might look like. This is simulated data. It never looks this pretty. Usually you have like one that goes down there or something. But so the point here, though, is that we have data across time on the x-axis. The y-axis is any arbitrary unit. And we have multiple data sets for multiple people. And so this is the format of the data that I work with, is lots of time points. I don't really care about how many people I have. I try to get at least 10. That tends to help with picking out signal from noise in ways I'll describe later. But this is the data that I'm talking about today, just to kind of frame it. So this brings about some brand new questions for us as psychologists that have always kind of been lurking. So what are the behavioral, psychological, and physiological processes that humans exhibit, right? That's usually what our papers are trying to do. We're trying to find out some generalizable thing about psychological and physiological behaviors of humans. But now we can look at it across time rather than have a cross-sectional study and say, well, depression and anxiety co-occur. Now we can look for that individual. Do they tend to co-occur, or does one lead the other one? So does depression lead their anxiety? So maybe we should target depression and get more nuanced questions such as that. So the majority of analytic approaches, such as multi-level modeling, assume that these processes are identical for all individuals. So just carrying on with the depression and anxiety example, most modeling techniques for looking at time series data from a multi-level perspective, they're going to require that you say that depression always leads anxiety, and you'll get a coefficient for that across people. But the question remains of whether or not we actually do have psychological processes that are similar across all human beings, right? So that's one thing that we're trying to investigate now as a field, I believe, is this a tenable assumption that all individuals have similar psychological processes? Or are there nuances and differences in the psychological processes? And we can have differences within a healthy population as well as within clinical populations. And then if we do see differences across individuals, are they meaningful, or is that just noise because they didn't understand the question we were asking? Or is it an idiosyncratic aspect of that person that's just not interesting, like just something that's unique to them but not psychologically relevant or interesting? And more specifically, does one variable, these are more specific questions, does one variable mediate the relationship between other variables for humans? Now, we've asked this a lot in cross-sectional studies or panel studies, but now we can see for an individual, for instance, of maybe the relationship between depression and anxiety is caused by stress, or is mediated by stress. That really is that when I'm depressed, I have a little bit more stress because I'm not going into work, and then that causes my anxiety. So we can get models such as this at the individual level, and then after, or are there moderation effects for these dynamic processes? And so this kind of is a way in which I'm going to talk about things for the remainder of the talk, is starting more generally, like what are aspects that we see consistently across human beings that maybe might be generalizable, and how do we assess those? How do we quantify that? And then more specifically, once we get at that, I'll show you some models of individual level processes, and we can see a little bit of how they differ from the group level process. Oh yeah, and then there's the one variable that seems central to the process. Anyone who's familiar with network-based approaches have heard of the word hub. If you haven't heard of it from that approach, you probably could figure out what it is. A hub is a center, and it connects other things. It's a hub. And so that would be something that is central to a process. So for instance, if you have one symptom that seems related to all other symptoms, you might be able to, if you change that symptom, maybe that has a downstream effect on everything else. And so identifying these processes, or what's central to a process, is also one thing that people are looking at the individual level. And then what is a sign of the relation? So is it positive or is it negative? And so here we're getting into more of the details of the individual level processes. Okay, this makes people uncomfortable sometimes when I come and say that I'm going to show them a bunch of data-driven searches with no information to guide it other than what the data provide. And so I stole this from a colleague of mine at UNC. He's in the statistics department, Shankar. So we don't really have hypotheses at the individual level yet. If you as a person walk into an office, like a clinician's office, they don't know your psychological processes yet. I don't know if anxiety tends to occur before your depression or the reverse. Like I don't know. And so we kind of need these data-driven searches until we start to identify maybe what is nomothetic or consistent across all individuals, that I can say, okay, for that person, I know they're going to have this relation, versus what is person-specific or might vary a lot across individuals. And so much of our information has been obtained from inter-individual analysis. So how do individuals differ kind of from a between-person perspective? And they might not describe any one person. So my advisor, Peter Molinar, wrote a manifesto on person-specific psychology and shows very elegantly there that the model you obtain when you look cross-sectionally across people might not define any individual when you look across time. And so it's just because of a statistical property from aggregation. And so that's really disheartening, perhaps, because what we think we've been learning, but then sometimes it does. And so I think that that's what I'm trying to say, is that this is still up for, still an open question. So just because we see that depression and anxiety diagnoses tend to co-occur across individuals, when we look across days, we might not see that they actually overlap for everybody who has a depression diagnosis when you look across time. And then we can, the hypothesis for patterns don't always exist. And so what might scare people, especially psychologists, when they hear anything about data-driven searches, especially 100% data-driven searches, is this danger zone. Like, we've all heard of p-hacking, and we've all been trained, don't do that. And so this is, I think, what is problematic, right, if anybody's doing that. This is what we're used to, the traditional research, where you know a little bit about statistics, you know a little bit about substantive experience, you do your regression, and you make an inference there. Machine learning, and then this data science in the center is kind of where we're going to be at during this talk. So we are doing a little bit of hacking. We have some statistical knowledge, and we have some substantive expertise, and that's what's driving all of these models that I'm going to show. All right, so I'm going to discuss GIMME. That is the main product coming out of my lab. It's a R package that we produced and maintain quite daily, and it is right in the center here of data science. It stands for Group Iterative Multiple Model Estimation. What we are doing is we are estimating multiple models across individuals to identify group level paths as well as individual level paths. And I'll go into that when I talk about background on GIMME. And then kind of taking a turn from how I usually give talks, is I'm going to talk mainly about applications as a way to show you some of the methodological developments that we've added on to the original GIMME. And I invite you to think of any processes that are interesting to you, either like health processes or stress processes, whatever is interesting to you about psychology, because throughout most of these, even if I'm talking about MRI data, again, you could swap it in for whatever process is interesting to you. And then I'll discuss just a slide of future directions that we're taking now. But so what is GIMME? What is this thing that I'm talking about? It's a method for arriving at generalizable. So that would be these black paths. They're the thickest paths because they're estimated for everybody in these examples. Generalizable as well as person-specific patterns of relations among time series variables. So person-specific in this context would be these gray lines. Again, thickness indicates the number of people who have those lines. We're going to see a lot of this today. And so, for instance, here I have daily diary results where we have that for everybody, stress was related to negative affect. And that could be something we could have hypothesized before, but now the data have told us that yes, across most individuals, stress relates to negative affect. What we saw was for a subset, and that's highlighted with this green path that I'll explain the details a little bit later, negative affect is related to social affiliation, or how affiliated they feel with their peers, which is interesting to know that there's a subset of people who have that, but then also a subset of people who do not have that relation. And same thing with brain regions. We have this auditory region is related to a motor region. This isn't a well-defined motor auditory task, so that was one that we really wanted to see because we had tried to induce it, and we got it. And so GIMME produces these plots. This is kind of the whole goal of it, is we're trying to look at time series variables, or variables that are collected across time intensively, as Jason mentioned. So we have at least 60 time points, let's say. With MRI, we might have as much as 600 time points. With daily diary, we don't tend to get too much more than 100 if we're lucky. So this is the type of data that we're working with. The motivation has been, as I mentioned, is that the temporal relations among variables may differ greatly across individuals. And this has been shown since 1980, when people first started doing daily diary studies. Actually, the first data I have from that is Lebo and Nessarode's data from 1979. They saw that across 5 individuals who were nurses, who were all pregnant, very specific sample, that their measurement models varied widely. And so it's been well documented that patterns of temporal relations or dynamic relations among variables differ across individuals, and that's problematic analytically. So when analysis is conducted on aggregated data, the end model may fail to describe any one individual. You have spurious relations that surface because of the aggregation process, or third variable relations, and so you can end up with an aggregate model, but if it doesn't work for any one individual, it's not really informing the science. And so the goals of GIMME were born out of these two, knowing that we need individual level models, but then also that individual level models sometimes have noise, is to arrive at temporal patterns of relations among variables that generalize to the population. So what can we actually state about human processes? Can I state that my sample suggests that there's a relationship between stress and negative affect for humans? Right? Like that's the type of statement that we would want to be able to make, rather than going the opposite direction and forcing it for everybody and then looking at the coefficients, right? So we're trying to see like what does actually generalize across our sample of individuals. And then we also want to arrive at reliable person-specific relations. As I mentioned, my personal motivation in my work is to be able to describe individuals at the individual level. If there's anything that is generalizable that can be used to help me, that would be great. But ultimately, I feel like the field is going towards more person-specific, we see this in medicine as well, more person-specific approaches to treating people. And so if we can model them at the individual level, then we can get closer to developing treatment plans that are a little bit more tailored to them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about technical details, because I feel like otherwise it's all too abstract and it's hard to kind of focus, but I don't want to inundate you too much with equations, though they're impossible to avoid. So we're just going to get right into that. So I've been showing these types of depictions where we have 3 variables, let's say here, and I've only talked about the lines in terms of color, but here I also have this dashed line. And so that would be a lagged relation. So if this were days, moods that were gathered across day, this might be at a previous day, how does it predict the next day activity for a given variable? Here's a couple. These are brain regions, but let's stick with daily diary. So let's say that this model suggests that for stress that was measured on one day, the next day you have some sort of you feel highly reactive or overstimulated by your surroundings. Whereas if you're moody on the same day, this is a contemporaneous relation, if you're moody on the same day, that relates to reactivity on that day. And so we use this notation throughout, where the solid lines indicate contemporaneous. And so I've been talking about across days, but this could also be within a day. So for instance, stress relates to reactivity when I look at the morning relating to the evening, or the morning relating to 2 hours later. And so the temporal relationship, the temporal distance between the variables do not matter for this modeling framework. But of course, if you have them too far apart, then you'll never get these lagged relations, because maybe what happened a week ago doesn't matter to you today, right? And so the temporal resolution is important, but it's also not overly limiting. Here I have it in equation form, so we have our A matrix, that's where the A coefficient up there comes from. We have eta at time being predicted by itself at time. This is doable within a structural equation modeling framework. We then add in the lagged variables. Again, this is all within structural equation modeling framework, so we just have t variables, the time variables, appended with the t-1 variables, and then we can run it through and set up our beta matrix to contain both the A and the phi matrix here. The noise is assumed to be uncorrelated across time, and since we take into account contemporaneous relations right here, directly among the observed variables, or latent variables, we assume that the errors also are not correlated with each other at time. So the error for stress is not related to the error for moody, because if these two had a contemporaneous relationship, we would have found a relation between them. So this is called Unified SEM. It is the framework from which we work. It was first introduced into MRI in 2007, and it's a structural equation modeling approach for estimating what's called structural VAR models, which have been around for a very long time. So USEM, a little bit new. Structural VARs, which is what I have written here, very old. So Granger causality. This is extremely important to our model search approach, and I'm going to explain why. Because I gave a talk to my quantitative folks back at UNC, and this was what they found most interesting, because it was counterintuitive to them for some reason. So I thought maybe it would be for you too. So here we have the same model, right? So I have 2 variables now instead of 3 to make it a little bit easier. They're both, this is variable at t, and this is this right here represents an autoregressive relation. So see how it's dashed, and down here, I mentioned that these dashed lines indicate lagged relations. So this is an autoregressive relation. This is saying that variable 1 predicts itself at the next time point. Again, the next time point could be whatever. In the world of MRI, that's the next second. In the world of daily diaries, that's the next day. And so here I have a contemporaneous relation. And I have that, if we just think of regular regression, variable 1 is on the left-hand side, and it's being predicted by variable 2 at the same time, but it's also being predicted by itself at t minus 1. So I have 2 variables that are, or two sources of explanation for variable 1 at time. If I take out these autoregressive paths, then the path going this way, if we think back to simple regression, A predicting B, or B predicting A, the standardized solution is the same. We get a correlation coefficient. So if I don't have any covariates, then A12 is the same as A21, right? It's explaining the same amount of variance. As soon as I add in these autoregressive paths, which are covariates, then they no longer equal each other. And so we use this to identify directionality, and that's Granger causality. After I take into account the autoregressive paths, which direction explains more variability in the overall model. So after taking into account this autoregressive path, does A21 explain more than if I go the other direction? Granger causality can be bidirectional. We can have both paths. There's nothing to stop that. Convergence issues sometimes arise in SEM, but that's outside of Granger causality. And so this is how we start getting at directionality of relations that are contemporaneous. It's a little bit easier for the lagged because we have different variables rather than these two to try to see if they are predicting each other. Excuse me. Okay. So now that we know the modeling framework, we know that we have lagged relations, which are the autoregressive relations of how a variable predicts itself, or the multivariate relations of how another variable predicts it. Now we go to the model building. So we first arrive at a group level model by selecting paths that improve the majority of individuals' models according to modification indices within structural equation modeling. And we Bonferroni correct every modification indices for the number of individuals that we're looking across. And so we first arrive at a group level model by just starting with all of the autoregressive paths open and then adding in paths at the group level that will be estimated for everybody if they are significant for at least the majority of individuals. We identified the majority as our default at 75% because MRI studies have indicated that given the noise level in the data of MRI, you are likely to recover 75% of relations. For daily diary studies, maybe we need to lower it to 50% because we have a little bit more measurement error there. So this can be toggled. It's not hard set at 75, that's just a default. So once we come up with the individual level models, we then get to our, once we start with our group level model, we then get to our individual level models. So for person A, we might have this path added, these 2 paths down here, whereas for person B, we get different paths added. And again, we use MIs, modification indices, in a feed-forward fashion where we add MIs. The great thing about modification indices is that they take into account what's already in the model. So we're saying, knowing that brain region 3 predicts brain region 4 here, is there added benefit to adding in this line in our overall model fit? And so we can test it significantly because it's chi-square distributed. It has a lot of nice properties like that. So we add paths at the individual level after the group level. We find that if we do not have any group level paths and I just search for an individual level model, we get a lot of spurious connections. And so starting with any information really helps clean up these models. So any data-driven approach is really it has the risk of overfitting. So what I mean by overfitting is modeling noise. And so I could keep adding relations until I have a saturated model and my model's perfectly explained, but maybe none of them actually but it's kind of a balancing act of adding paths that explain things, but then not adding so many that you're fitting some noise in the data. And so we try to accommodate that in two ways. The first way is you can think of this search across individuals for what relations are significant for the majority is similar to a meta-analytic approach, where you might have cross-sectional data from Seattle and from Oregon and then also from Vancouver. And you might see if the finding replicates. If you're finding that depression relates to anxiety, replicates across these three different samples. And this is similar to a multitask approach that's done in machine learning, where you first arrive at what is constant across individuals and then you add individual nuances after that. And so that's done in some machine learning approaches. So that's one way to try to avoid overfitting, is by finding what's consistent and picking out signal from noise. And then this better explains the meta-analysis perspective. So in typical analysis, typical like cross-sectional analysis that we see in psychology research, I might collect 4 samples. So like maybe this is the Vancouver sample, this is Oregon, this is like Portland, and this is Seattle, this is a 4th sample. And in meta-analysis, you look for what's consistent across these samples. In time series analysis, instead of having n be the number of observations within a sample, within one sample, my number of observations is t, it's the number of time points that I have. And so we're really fortunate in that I have lots of samples. Most studies have more than 2 people, right? And so if I have even 10 people, I have 10 samples with which to see which relations replicate. So do we have a relationship between anxiety and depression for the majority of our sample? Can we say that that's something that probably exists for most people? And so it's a very similar mentality behind meta-analysis, which you might be more familiar with. And then another way to avoid overfitting is we have a strict criteria used for the addition of relations. As I mentioned, we use Bonferroni correction, which is a rather strict one. And the model fit indicates when we stop searching. So we could, as I mentioned, keep adding paths, and eventually we'll have a saturated model. It'll fit perfectly. But we stop once it's good according to at least 2 fit indices. And I know there's some work done here on fit indices, and especially with missing data, so I'm excited to find out more about that this afternoon. And so, because this is such an important part to our search, is that we stop once the model is deemed that it fits well enough. So then we don't just keep adding paths, even if they are significant for that individual. And so in that way, this is similar to other DAG approaches, directed acyclical graph approaches. They stop once the model fit indicates that it is an okay solution. And that prevents us from just adding ad nauseum paths and modeling noise. So both of these 2 things seem to be working almost too well, because we have virtually no false positives when we do simulated data examples. The problem, if anything, is that we're too conservative and we don't recover enough of the paths. So that fills me with I would prefer to miss some paths than to have false positives, because I don't want to misinterpret a relation. And so I'm okay with how we're balancing those 2 possibilities of type 1 and type 2 errors. All right, so here's a summary, because there was a lot that was thrown at you. So there's noise in processes. There's noise in our data. We don't want to model it. And so and because of that, some individuals' relations might not be detected, right? So there's Smith et al. Did a very large paper where they looked at MRI data, and they're the ones who came up with that 75% that with a certain number of time points you can expect to detect a relation with 75% accuracy. Of course, with daily diary it might be different. But so some relations that are in your data generating model or your simulated data or the person's true data, they might be missed just because of noise. And so that's a problem. Another problem is that starting individual level model searches with some information, or I guess this is the solution, with some information greatly improves the accuracy in the recovery of relations. So by starting with the group level search and then adding individual level, we get much better accuracy in the recovery of the individual level paths. When we just do individual level on their own, we get incorrect directionality, we get spurious findings, and so we need to really start with whatever information we can find. So we find what's consistent across individuals. And this follows some work by Bud McCallum. He's done a lot to criticize and offer suggestions for how to use modification indices in this type of research, in model modification. And so one of his main suggestions has been to always bring models as close to the true model as you can before using modification indices to guide searches. And so that's what we're trying to do with the group level search, is to bring the individual level models as close as they are to their real one by starting it with the group level first. And so finding relations that are consistent across individuals before moving to the individual level has worked. And I love citing this one because they're not me, and they agree. And so it seems to be working. It's intuitive, and it's we aren't the only ones to do it. Like I mentioned, it's called multitask when it's in machine learning, which is something I'm recently learned about. So it's just a matter of finding what's consistent, and then it serves two purposes. Number one, we get to say what generalizes across a sample, or what might generalize to a population. And then number two, we get better individual level models. So then I can trust a little bit better the paths that I have, because we use such a strict criteria for adding paths, and also we end the searches before it can add too many false positives. Okay, so now maybe we get into the fun part of applications, but I felt like you really had to understand what was happening before I start throwing results at you. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit of our first uses. So when we first developed GIMME, how were people using it, and what kind of, because you get these maps, right? You get all these lines connecting variables, or if you're looking at a matrix form, you get a bunch of matrices with some zeros in it and some non-zeros. How do you make sense of all of that? So I want to kind of walk through how people have been using that to make inferences. And that led to a number of extensions, one being identifying subsets of individuals who are similar, another being including exogenous variables and basis vectors. We won't get too much into basis vectors because that's more for MRI and maybe for like a stress response vector function. But, and then latent variable modeling, because we know in the world of psychology that our measurements are slightly imperfect, and so we often use latent variables to try to tease apart measurement error from the construct we're interested in. And then scaling up use for more variables. So currently we cap out, the original GIMME caps out at about 25 variables, which is fine for a lot of studies. Probably daily diary, it might be okay, but because you're not going to ask people hundreds of questions every day. But for brain data and some other data that we might have access to, we needed to be able to handle more than 25 variables. So these are the main applications that I'll be talking about. So one of the first applications was done by some colleagues at Penn State. We conducted GIMME first across the sample, and so that's represented here. This was an interesting study that maybe you could tell from the title. We had nicotine-deprived smokers. So what we did is Steve Wilson, participants were chronic smokers, so addicted smokers who smoked at least, I think, 5 or 10 a day. And they were instructed to not smoke the night before, come in the morning without smoking, and then we were going to put them in a scanner. And they did CO2 testing to make sure that they really hadn't smoked. And then when they were in a scanner, they had to do what's called an NBAC test. So they had to do a working memory task. And during one of the tasks, they just did it as normal. And they were told during the break that they're allowed to go have a cigarette if they wanted. So that was part of it, was who went and had a cigarette. And then the second time they did it, research assistant came and put in what felt like a cigarette in between their fingers, which if you've ever smoked cigarettes or been addicted to smokers, that's a really big trigger for people. They want a cigarette. They want to smoke it when they have it in their hands. And so this was during that part where they are laying in the machine, they're doing a working memory task, but they have this huge distraction in their hand. And so I just thought it was really interesting data for that reason. We didn't focus on that with this analysis. We just focused on what are the brain processes when people are doing this working memory task. And so we selected brain regions that tend to be related to working memory. This is what we found at the group level. And then we're like, okay, that's cool. That fits in with other research. But we want to tease this apart and see what's happening when people are doing poorly versus well. So we broke it up into 4 quartiles. This lowest quartile, these are the people who did the worst. These people did second worst, third, and then these are the best people. And then what's depicted here are the group level paths that surfaced when we broke them out. And so what you can see is that the Q4 is same as the whole group level. I want to note that all of these group level paths that were done when we smushed them all together resurfaced with all of this analyses. And so what's gray here are the paths that were unique to these quartiles. And so we see a lot more paths happening at Q1, and this is just at the group level. So like all of these people who were doing very poorly had these paths added, which might be some sort of like error feedback system, like, oh, I'm getting this wrong, and then you realize it. And so what we also found was we took degree. And so again, if you've been following any of the network literature that's coming out of mainly the Netherlands, they've been talking a lot about network theory approaches. And so you can quantify these maps or these networks as in terms of what's the number of paths that they have and what's the weight of the paths and where is the hub and things like that. And so we wanted to quantify this and not just descriptively say, look, these people seem to have a lot of paths. And so when we compared these 4 groups, we found that those in the highest performing had the fewest paths. And that follows with a lot of MRI literature suggesting that less is more, that the fewer paths you have, the better you tend to do in working memory tasks, right? Because you're just like doing it, right? There's not too much processing needed. You're very efficient at this point. This contrasts language learning. And so this was another early use with other researchers who were all at Penn State. Now she's back in Beijing. And so we conducted GIMME analysis and then examined results post hoc to identify descriptive differences among predefined groups. So what we did was we ran GIMME, and then we ran it at 2 times. We ran it before they learned and then after learning. And so they're in the scanner and they're trying to learn a second language. And we had successful learners, non-successful learners defined by having a 5% improvement on their scores after being trained. And non-learners were not given the task at all. They were just shown the words with no instruction to learn it. So this is kind of our baseline. If you're just shown words, what happens? And so this group, Ping Li was the PI, they interpret it more descriptively of talking about how the process is different for successful learners versus non-successful, and this is 100% descriptive. It's probably one of the more cited studies that's used GIMME, and they were very excited about these results because it followed in with their expectations. So it's always nice when something data-driven follows exactly what you would hope to find anyway. So now, in both of those examples and in much of the work that we initially did with GIMME, everybody kept putting things into subgroups. So naturally, we wanted to embed that into the procedure because we thought maybe that could even further help things. If getting the group level helps with individual level, what if I had subgroup level? Would that even refine things further so then my individual level processes are even better and easier to find? So Tig Henry, a former student of mine, implemented confirmatory subgroups. And so what this does is we start with a group level path, and then if you have 4 subgroups, let's say that they are grouped based on age. We have maybe toddler, middle schooler, and then adolescents and adults. You would indicate that to the program a priori, and then you arrive at subgroup level paths now after getting the group level. And then you can make statements not just about the group level, but also about subgroups. So for instance, the toddlers, they looked like this. And then again, individual level paths are obtained as a last step. And part of the motivation here again is that because group level, the group level search helps obtain more precision in our individual level search so much, adding more information by saying, oh, well, you're a subgroup with, you're with all these other toddlers, so you might have something in common with them. Let's search to see if you do, and then start off your individual level path with that. So again, it's trying to use information that's shared across individuals. An important aspect that I haven't really stressed is that if there are no similarities that match if there are not enough relations that exist for what we call the majority, then no paths are added at the group or the subgroup level. So we're not forcing them to have stuff in common if they aren't in common. And then again, we get to our individual level paths. And we have found in this work that adding in the subgroup level, we get even more recovery of the individual level paths. So again, this is an MRI study, but the connections here are group level, and then we have typically developing controlled, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD combined, and ADHD inattentive type, 2 different types of ADHD. And the goal here was to identify what is similar across all of our brains for these individuals. They were aged 9 to 16, taken from Damien Farr's lab out in OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University. And then what's different? So the autism spectrum disorder, what we were looking for in particular were a lot of symptom overlap occurs between these 3 diagnoses. And so we wanted to see which brain processes, aspects of brain processes tend to co-occur maybe across these 2 groups. We did find a couple that co-occurred across all ADHD, or excuse me, this ADHD and this ASD, these 2 groups. And then we found more similarities between the 2 ADHD types, indicating that even though the representation is a little bit different, they are more similar in their brain processes than to ASD. And so again, this is just trying to further refine things. There's a problem though, is that in life and in psychology, we don't always know our subgroups. So let's say I have a sample of undergrad students. I know they're different, right? I know that not all undergrads are the same. They might differ based on gender. They might differ based on age. They could differ across so many different dimensions. I might not know the best way to cluster them or to subset them a priori. So we were motivated to do data-driven clustering. And part of the motivation, again, is I work with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD data quite a bit, and there's heterogeneity in the symptoms. And so, of course, there's going to be heterogeneity across time and how they're expressed behaviorally. There's also going to be heterogeneity in their brain processes. So within a predefined category, which is ADHD, I know there's going to be heterogeneity in their processes. Same thing with borderline personality disorder, working with Aidan Wright at Pitt. And then age groups and ASD diagnoses was a big one that has been talked about for years, that we know that they have brain differences. So trying to find one brain type is kind of being abandoned. So this suggests that there might be subgroups within predefined subgroups, right? So we have subgroups within subgroups. I might say this is an ASD sample, but within that I know there's going to be differences. So we wanted to identify them in a data-driven way. A real motivation for this too was when we first started getting all these individual level maps. If you could imagine laying them all on a floor in front of you and trying to find what's similar in them, like, oh, maybe those 2 people have something in common because they both have that relation, you very quickly lose your mind, because any 2 people might have one path in relation, but then you really want to find, like, what are the patterns of relations that are consistent across maybe these 5 people or something. So it became really hard to make sense of the individual level maps, and we wanted to make that a little easier. So in pictures, this is basically my motivation. I could subset people. Here I put all of the females together and all of the males. But you'll notice that there's differences. Like, so these people have green paths and they're all above these black, and then over here this person has the red paths, which are similar to these, which half of the male, 3 out of the 5 males have, but you also see these males who have what, if I were going to hard classify people by gender, I might find that this is the typical male brain, this is the typical female brain, but I'm totally ignoring the within gender or the within subgroup deviation or variation. And so same thing happens with diagnostic categories. I might say these are ADHD, these are TDCs, but they're different, and we're not acknowledging that or letting the approach. If we're doing it a priori, we're not acknowledging this at all. And so what we are aiming to do, and what we're doing somewhat successfully, is we're clustering people based on their patterns. So here I've put all of these people who have this pattern together, all the people who have this pattern together, and maybe they are different by diagnostic category, but maybe they're not. Maybe they are 2 categories, 2 subtypes within the same diagnostic category. And so I wanted to be able to parse about these, and so did my collaborators who actually had the data. And so what did we find? I'm not going to, again, go through any of the details of how subgrouping GIMME works, because there's simply no time, and also this is a mixed audience. But subgrouping GIMME took a few years to develop, and it's working very well. We can correctly recover subgroups based solely on the data. And so what we're doing is we're classifying people, much like here, based on the patterns of relations we're getting in their contemporaneous and lagged relations. And so we're grouping them. We use a community detection approach called walk-trap, if you're familiar with that. And so it hard classifies people. So there's no, it's not a probabilistic classification, and it works very well for the type of matrices that we feed into it. So subgrouping is working well on data that we generated to be like MRI data. It's working well on data that we generate to be like daily diary data. Here, Stephanie Lane, a former student of mine, also investigated whether how low we can go with our number of time points, and it's in this paper that we realized that we can't go as low as 30. That's no surprise for structural equation modeling, but we wanted to test the limits. We had convergence issues, and we also had a very difficult time detecting results, or detecting paths. So we recommend at least 60 time points coming from this daily diary study. And we also had some empirical work, and this is this is one of the situations where I kind of hated quantitative psychology journals because I love them overall. But I work with so many neuroscientists, and they have 30-day turnarounds for the reviews and for the revisions. And so what came out before our paper was an application of it. This is a 2017 one. It came out like months before this paper, so they couldn't even cite the work. We had to explain it all again in this supplemental material. So we were able to classify individuals based on their diagnostic status and symptoms using their functional brain data. So here, working with Rebecca Price at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, she had a sample of depressed, non-depressed people, and she played them depressing music, and we were able to classify based on their brain patterns and their response to the depressed music who was depressed and who was not. And then in another study, we took only the people who had the major depression diagnosis, and we put them in a scanner, we looked at their resting state, and we were able to subdivide people based entirely on if they had an anxiety diagnosis as well. So we could identify depressed anxiety brains versus depressed brains. And so that was pretty cool. And again, that's like a subset within depression. We also arrived at subsets of people with distinct behavioral patterns. That was done with Aidan Wright, who's also at Pittsburgh. And then we identified risk-taking individuals and tasks designed to produce risk-taking behaviors. And so I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a second. But first, I want to give you some confidence that what we're finding is valid. So we did a lot of simulations in these two studies, and I won't bore you with the bar graphs, but it's working. We are able to put people into the right groups when I generate the data. But of course, we generated the data, and it's beautiful data, and it's easily separatable and da-da-da. So yes, it's working, but we wanted to test it with real data. So in collaboration with Joe Hopfinger, who's at UNC, we got a little grant, and we collected data to validate the subgrouping GIMME approach. And we had them do two tasks. Motor task with their eyes closed. So their eyes are closed. When they hear a noise, they're supposed to hit a button. And then we track to make sure that they're doing it. We wake them up if they fall asleep. So this is a motor and auditory. So you would expect a connection between auditory regions and motor regions in the brain. Now we also had face processing. In this one, their eyes are open, so totally different from a brain processing perspective, especially if you're looking at visual processing. And now they're processing faces, and I don't know how many of you know this. I didn't know this before I started doing neuroimaging, but we have an area in our brain called the facial fusiform area. Facial fusiform gyrus is also what it's called, and it processes faces. When you put a face in front of someone, it just lights up. It doesn't always light up for people who have ASD diagnoses. So it's a very interesting area. It's very specific to humans. We process faces. And so with face processing, they have the same motor task where they hear a noise and they're supposed to do the digital motor task. But now they also see faces at the exact same time. So now we're adding visual processing in with this simple task. And what did we get? We were able to successfully cluster people into two subgroups. 93% of the people who were in the motor task, and again, this is just looking at their brain data, no outside information about what task they were in. We separated people, 93% of the individuals were correctly put together into subgroup A. 93% of the other individuals who were doing the face motor task were correctly put together in subgroup B. In subgroup B, this is where they're doing the face motor task. We see that the visual area, right occipital lobe, is related to the facial fusiform area, which is exactly what you would expect because now they're processing faces in addition to the visual cues. We also see more relationship between visual areas and the motor areas, which makes sense because now their eyes are opened. When their eyes are closed, we don't see that relationship between visual and anything much outside in the group level paths. And we also don't have any relationship to the FFA, except for a few people who, honestly, when their eyes are closed, we don't know what they're thinking about. And so that's been a large caveat to this. We're like, it's kind of resting state. They're probably just daydreaming and hitting a button occasionally. Like, we don't know what they're actually thinking about, but their eyes are closed and we don't see visual relating to the motor or auditory stimuli, which makes sense. And then I added in a daily diary study quickly to this talk, right before the talk, because I realized that I did have some studies on daily diary that I'd forgotten to include here. So here, this is with Aidan Wright. He collected it with Sims. And we have 94 individuals. They were all diagnosed with a personality disorder. And I'm still learning a lot about personality disorders, but what I have learned from Aidan is that they tend to co-occur. So if you have a narcissistic personality disorder, you might have antisocial as well, or borderline. And so these are highly comorbid individuals. They have at least one personality disorder. Some of them had many more. He collected data for 110 days. We kept every individual who had at least 60 days of data. And so this is what we found. We actually found 3 subgroups, but subgroup 3 looked identical to this in terms of the paths. So I am only showing 2 for clarity. You might ask, then how are they different? Subgroup 2 had, this was almost 0. Their relationship between negative affect and stress was very low for the majority of individuals in this group. For the other group, it was quite high. So they were clustered based on the value or the quantitative aspect of their models, whereas this subgroup was separated based on a qualitative aspect or the presence of a relation that didn't exist for the majority of people in the other subgroups. And so here we found that negative affect, this is actually the slide I showed early on, or the figure I showed early on. Stress related to negative affect for the majority of people in the sample, but negative affect for this subset related to social affiliation. And people who were in this subset were the majority of people who had a narcissistic and or borderline personality diagnoses. The people in the other subsets did not have those diagnoses at the same levels, and this was significant at a chi-square level when we did crosstab tests. Yeah, so we've been able to kind of identify, this was the first time we've been able to look a little bit into diagnostic category using behavioral data or self-report data. And here's a couple of people. So if we start with group level, right, so we try to get stuff that's nomothetic or that might apply to the majority of individuals in the population from which it comes. If we look at our group level sample, and then we can make some inferences about the subgroup level. But then we're finally getting down to what was the original purpose for me, which was getting to these individual level paths. And we use heat map color system here, where in heat maps, red means hot or high, blue is cold or low. And so here we see that these are 2 people who are both in subgroup 1. So we see a relationship between affiliation and negative affect, which is negative for them. There's a feedback system for this person. We also see that this person has negative affect related to dominance, which has clear clinical relevance, especially for somebody with a personality disorder, is that when you're feeling bad, if you start exhibiting dominant personality traits, which for this person, again, given that they have a personality disorder, might be a dysfunctional response or something that's not working for them in their lives, that's important for a clinician to know about. Similarly, for this person, their dominance relates to positive affect. So when they're dominating people, they tend to feel good. It's really good to know, right? Maybe we can find other things that make them feel good, you know. And then we see here a mediating, right? They're stressed out, dominate someone, feel good. So it's this is how we're kind of. And Aidan Wright, who worked on this project with me, he led the project. He's a clinical psychologist, and so he's trying to get at these so he can eventually have his patients and his practice be informed by this. We also have, this is Ethan McCormick's work. He is a student in the developmental program at UNC, but has kind of joined our lab. So he did both confirmatory and exploratory subgrouping with GIMME. And so first he did confirmatory, where he had 3 age groups. And, but the problem was, the whole purpose of the study was to look at risk-taking, and with the assumption that adolescents would take greater risks in this task than the older people. And in their sample, that didn't hold. The adolescents and the other 2 age groups, who were young adults and older adults, all took risks equally the same. And so as we're looking at their brains while they're doing this risk-taking task, or this task that gives you the option to take risks, it's a balloon that's going to pop, and the score keeps going up the bigger it gets. And so if you hit your space bar, it stops going up, but you also stop getting points. So some people, and you don't know when it's going to pop. And so it's a risk-taking thing. Some people it would always pop because they were really high risk and wanted that reward. So, but then when we did exploratory subgrouping, we found 2 groups. And when we did post hoc tests, this is maybe subgroup A, subgroup B, we post hoc labeled them high risk and low risk. I want to make it clear that this wasn't confirmatory. This is totally data driven. We found that people who were in this group, which had these paths added to their models, they tended to be the high risk takers, and they were equally distributed across the age groups. And so I wanted to show this example to really highlight that the predefined categories that they had based their whole study on, which was age groups, didn't let them find what they were looking for, but a data-driven clustering, while they were doing a risk-taking task, was able to separate out who's taking high risks and who's not. And they chose these regions because certain combinations of them should be implicated in risk-taking, and we found results that matched that with this group. Okay, so seems like the outline, seems like we have a lot to go. The rest of it's very quick. Just being cognizant of the time. So Cara Monday, another student in my lab, she added the option to have exogenous variables. And so the graphical VAR or other approaches for doing data-driven searches until very recently also did not allow for exogenous variables. Denny Borsboom informed me that they did it too, and he saw me give a talk that mentioned it. So we're not the only ones. But so here we have something like temperature, which is exogenous. That is outside of your emotional system. It doesn't matter how mad you are, you did not make it rain, right? But it raining might influence your internal system. And so that's an exogenous variable. Here we have temperature might influence your positive affect or your negative affect. Positive and negative affect might be related. And so this is just an exemplar model that Cara depicted for the paper to show what the system is, and then here's the exogenous variable. So what does this look like with a different set of data from Aidan Wright? We found that we also included time here, so that's just a basis vector of 1 to t, and so it's a linear increase across time. So that's a way that we can detrend within the modeling framework while allowing for data-driven paths. Here we found no group-level paths. We found a few subgroup-level paths, and then temperature. These were our 2 exogenous variables. Temperature can relate to itself for the next time point, but also for a number of individuals, we see all these individual-level paths related to people's symptoms. Latent variable level modeling is very important for us at UNC. We do a lot of structural equation modeling. So the problem with a potential problem with network-based approaches that are on observed variables is that we are totally ignoring noise. And that's, in psychology, that's been a big focus. If you think there's whole lines of research about measurement. And here we have a latent construct or latent variable, and these would be maybe observed variables. We have our lambdas telling us how a latent variable is related to an observed variable, and then we have errors, the measurement errors of each one. And so now within GIMME, we worked with Ken Bolin, and this is our shared student, Zach Fisher. We implemented latent variable GIMME now so that you can have a latent variable model to try to get rid of some of the noise. So for instance, this might be depression. It's probably best to not just have one item for depression. It's probably best to have multiple indicators and to then find that assess the latent construct of depression. So now that's available. This is results from the data that I mentioned briefly earlier from 5 individuals who had, they were pregnant nurses in the 1970s. And Lebo and Nesserode collected this data and were gracious enough to share it with me. So here we have fatigue, social anxiety, well-being, and energy. And so we see that we had a number of group level paths, and these are all latent variables. And, but for these 2 individuals, we see, for instance, differences in the weight. So this one was much stronger than that one, which is much thinner. But we do see similar patterns that energy had a negative relationship with fatigue, and this was one finding that we found across all of the participants. We use model-implied instrumental variables for estimation, which is a mouthful, and it's a lot to explain. But I think it's important to mention because it is robust to structural misspecifications. And so as we're doing these data-driven searches, you might think like, well, if you add a wrong path here, how does that throw everything off? Well, in a typical SEM estimation framework, that might influence everything, but in a MIV framework, it doesn't, the latent variable model structure does not influence the measurement model at all, so that's a really cool property of it. And now, finally, scaling it up. Just trying to be cognizant of the time. So this has been an exciting collaboration between a student that, again, I'm also co-advising with Ken Bolin, and then Ethan, the adopted student from the development program. What we're doing here is we did equation by equation estimation. So we're taking it out of the structural equation modeling framework, and now we have a variable, k, is predicted by all other variables at time, plus all variables at time minus 1, and then we have error again. So this is just the structural vector autoregression model. K in parentheses indicates all variables except that variable, because we can't predict a variable with itself at the same time. We can at the previous time point, though. And so what we do is we come up with these relations using lasso and adaptive lasso. We're investigating both of those simultaneously. We stop the model search with the EBIC and also cross-validation. We provide 2 results. And then we identify relations that exist for the majority of individuals, much like in regular GIMME. We're just coming up with the majority in a different way. We're now using lasso to arrive at what exists in the majority of individuals' models. And then we rerun step 1 here, but now we force these group level paths to be estimated, and then we get the individual level. And similar to the SEM approach, we're finding that that cleans up results a lot. Here's what results look like. Here we do exogenous and squares because it's newer and we focused more on the visualization. And then here are moderating effects. So if these two moderated, this is the medial prefrontal cortex and the social task, if that social task moderated the relationship between PFC and here, you would see that with a knot there. So here we have exogenous and modulatory effects. Here's individual level paths, so you can see a little bit clearer how things are going along. 2 paths, one for main effects, and then these are all the moderating effects. We really did this, as I mentioned, to scale things up. And so working with a postdoc, Jessica Giroux in my lab, she has this wonderful data from the IBIS group. They scanned infants at 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months. Half of them are at high risk for developing autism spectrum disorder. And so these are 260 nodes, or 240 nodes, which are infant brain regions and how they relate to each other across time. And so that was the main purpose for coming up with scaling this up, was for investigating this IBIS data. Okay, so what are we doing next? We are conducting exploratory factor analysis. Ken Bolin and I got a little grant to do that. We're going to do it from within the MIV framework to try to beef up what we're doing with the latent variable GIMME stuff. And we are currently working on that with another student, Lan Lu. And then we perform group level, subgroup level, and individual level searches from the graphical Gaussian model framework. I've been talking with some folks in the Netherlands about that, and I'll be visiting them soon to carry that forward. And then totally switching gears, this would all be cool if we could then predict people's behaviors and psychological states and do change point detection to see when their patterns change across time. So that's kind of larger future directions of where do we go next now that we have the patterns of relations. So that's it. We have software available. It's in an R package. You can run GIMME by just saying GIMME and in parentheses name your data, and it'll give you all of that. So it's extremely user-friendly. We have a lot of tutorials and also an email that you can email us on, and it's free because it's in R. We also have MivSem, which Zach Fisher wrote in collaboration with Ken Bolin and I, and that does the SEM estimation using model implied instrumental variables that I discussed. Multi-lasso is this new one that came out with Ethan McCormick. He coded all of that up. It was an enormous feat that he did very quickly, very good. And so they're all available. This one's only on GitHub as of yet. We want to wait till we write it up before we put it on CRAN for our users. And last but not least, these are all the collaborators with whom this would not have happened. I know, she's the best. And additional acknowledgments, and of course there are more that I may have left out. But yeah, but thank you for your time. I know that this has been a whirlwind. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So thank you for that. It was really awesome. So it seems like, right, you started with the group level model and then you sort of of that. And I'm curious if you're interested in kind of the opposite. So could you take for some individuals, do those group level paths not apply, and is there a way to model that?
Yeah. So one benefit of having everybody have a path estimated is that then we have normally distributed coefficients. And so if it's not significant or useful for that person, it should be close to 0 in absolute value. And then what some of my collaborators have done is if there is a path that was of interest to them, then they look to see how that correlates with some outside of the study measure, like a baseline measure that's not time varying. So then you can get a correlation and see, so for people who had a very, if everybody had a relationship estimated for negative affect and stress and how those two are related, does the strength of that relationship relate to anything interesting, right? Like maybe the people for whom that's really low, maybe they meditate more. Right? And so we can correlate that. How many minutes a week do you meditate? And then maybe we see that explains why that relationship is a little bit unlinked for those people. And so I think that's a great question because those 25% for whom it's not significant, it could be noise, but it could also be that really just doesn't exist for them. And so it's certainly easy to evaluate post hoc for how many is this significant for and what, what might it mean? Yeah, thanks.
So I have a couple questions. So when I think GIMME is really cool, I'm more familiar, when I'm dealing with, repeated time points with an individual, kind of modeling differences from it's more like traditional regression-based way, like person-level predictors, maybe moderating the relationship between two variables, or random effects.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, particularly in cases if you have like a lot of person-level variables,
right.
Especially if they're like continuous, is there kind of you showed earlier like kind of breaking into quantiles,
right.
I believe. And is there kind of like maybe a systematic way of quantifying differences as a function of a level 2 predictor or person level predictor?
Yeah.
And then related question, suppose you could kind of reasonably model the heterogeneity with observed variables, predictors, random effects, what have you. Do you feel like there's maybe some sort of trade-off in terms of interpretability, model complexity, using kind of the approach of fitting a model for each person, or do you think that provided you have enough data for each person, it's maybe better to go flexibly?
Yeah, that's another great set of questions. I just want to have a figure up because I feel like it's easy to point at stuff. So just to make sure that I'm understanding, you're curious about, well, let's just do this, right? So let's say that I just want to recap to make sure I'm understanding. So kind of from a multi-level framework, I might add in knowledge about their diagnostic category to inform either their model discovery or the estimates. And so so this is dichotomized and I can break them out and then look at things. But then to do it in a continuous way, I'm not sure how to do that, to tell you the truth. And so I've been working closely with Sui Liu, who is out at UC Davis. She does multi-level modeling of time series, and we're like, we should work together because maybe what you know and what I know could be like put together to come up with some sort of solution like this, because it is we could be doing ourselves a disservice by having the individual level, or having GIMME not have any information about maybe an anxiety scale, or we're completely agnostic to traits, individual level traits. And for some that might seem like a benefit, but I think that if we could use that information, that would be great, but I'm not sure how to. Yeah. So I do think the model complexity might get too hard. Because another thing is that with the ML, multi-level model framework, we have a limit of how many paths or relations we can estimate, and so we can't include all of the possible individual level relations and then look, so it's kind of a difficult problem that we are thinking about and haven't gotten too far. To tell you the truth. Yeah. Yep.
I'm just curious, for most of the case studies that you presented, you're collecting what seems like all the variables at every time point.
Yeah.
Right? What happens to GIMME as that,
right.
Starts to break down? Right?
Yeah.
So like in situations where I'm sampling certain variables more often than others.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially if you have different temporal resolution, right? So you have kind of missing data between two variables, but really it's just that you didn't collect it or it's not continuous like all the others. So currently there's no way to combine those two levels of temporal resolution. What we have been doing is binning data. So what happens in that time point, can we consolidate it? And that might be useful for things like heart rate variability or actigraphy, right? In that if we look at it continuously, that in itself might actually not be the feature we're interested in. Maybe we are interested in how much did you move for those 2 hours, so we can combine that movement and then use that, time lock that with like whatever measure we're interested in, or we're collecting at like, you know, those intervals throughout the day. But yeah, so it's an ongoing problem. Yeah. You guys are really good at finding those. Yeah.
So I had a question, more philosophical, I think, about going to the latent variable.
Yeah.
And how you approach the assessment of measurement and latent constructs and the tension between the nomothetic and the idiographic.
Yeah.
So are you measuring the latent variables across individuals, but then looking at assessments within individuals?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a hard one.
How do you resolve that? Because you'd expect that the associations within the measures that you're using be different across individuals.
I know. Yes. So there's a few, so practically, I'll start practically and then move into philosophically. So practically, we could have different latent variable models for each individual and have, for instance, maybe latent variable 10 cross-loads onto, or a bunch of these observations cross-load onto latent variable 10, right? And so for that individual, maybe the model is slightly different. But one thing that I didn't mention is that for latent variable GIMME, we do estimate each person's latent variables separately. And so if they have different lambda coefficients, that's taken into account. And so if, for instance, this variable doesn't really load onto variable 10 for that person, we just expect that lambda to be close to 0 and it not really causing too much trouble. And that's a benefit of using the MIV estimation approach, is that having misspecified, that kind of misspecification in our measurement model doesn't really ruin the rest of the model. It's localized right there. And so another big thing about the MIV approach, which was really opened things up, is Ken, Zach, and I kind of had an epiphany when we saw this, is that if we have a measurement model that we think is fairly good, whatever we do to the latent variable model, so any of the relations among the latent variables, doesn't change those estimates at all. So we can be totally wrong with how these relations are for a given individual, and that doesn't affect their measurement model at all, which was fascinating. And that made us feel okay with going ahead with a data-driven search on top of a measurement model. And so the applications that we have done, we actually started with a data set that was collected by Borkanaw, again in the early 80s. And everybody had different factor model solutions. And so we abandoned that because we didn't know how to deal with it. So let's say that somebody there, to make it more concrete, let's say that they have we're trying to assess depression, and for somebody, it's mainly somatic symptoms. And so maybe for them, their depression is typified or indicated by sleeping a lot, eating a lot, and having low energy, right? Whereas for another person, maybe their depression is more mental, and it is having sad thoughts, ruminating, and considering suicide or something. And so for those two people, even though the latent construct we're trying to get at is depression, they have completely different models. And so what we're thinking, and Cara Monday is doing a lot of work on this, of what do we do when people have different measurement models. What she's doing is she's going to cluster them ahead of time and then just consider them two separate samples, that this is the sample for whom depression is somatic, and this is the sample for whom depression is more mental. And because we can't really consider them the same construct, I don't think. And then it's hard to figure out because we all know like measurement invariance exists, right? We have tests for that, and we can look to see if two individuals have similar models, but we're not really looking to see if they're statistically different. We just want to know, are they similar enough to say that they're the same thing? And we're not sure how to do that. So what we've been doing is, even though you have the option within GIMME in the way that we present it, you're allowed to have different measurement models for each person. In our data example here, we made sure everybody had the same measurement model, and we moved to this data because prior work had showed some consistency in individuals in these measurement models. And so I mean, that's a really important question, because some of the early investigations into heterogeneity in individual processes was using P technique, right? Like Ellen Hamacher, well, that's not so early, but like Peter Molinar and then Nesselrode, they were showing that people were different by using measurement models, and they were all vastly different in terms of their structure. And so that's going to be an ongoing thing to figure out, like how similar can my measures of well-being be between two people, or how different can they be, and I still call it the same construct. And I think it might be subjective more so than quantitative. Yeah.
To a certain extent, but would you also then have a follow-through problem in terms of looking at instructional paths between the variables having to do with scaling?
Oh, yeah.
Measurement and variance, because
Yeah.
the units and non-standardized regression coefficients would be different.
Right, right. Yeah, and especially because with MIV, we always choose, we have to choose one scaling indicator and have it be the same across all individuals, and that's the basis of MIV estimation. And so we have thought a lot about how to select that variable, because it is so important. And one of the things that we have come to is that it should have a lot of its variance explained by the other variables, and then vice versa. So it's kind of a way of choosing like the strongest model applied instrumental variable. And then another something related to that is that, to your point, one thing that we are trying to figure out still is, what do we do when there's different variance across the individuals? Because if their scaling indicator has a lot of variance and somebody else's doesn't, then that's going to impact everything. Yeah, yeah. So you're right, and it's ongoing. Yeah, and now that we have a grant to do exploratory factor analysis with MIV, I think we will figure it out. It's always a resource problem, you know. Or we'll do something. I don't know if we'll figure it out. But we'll come to some sort of conclusion. Yeah.
I'm curious about the rule that a path has to be significant in, say, 75%
Yeah.
of individuals to be included in the model.
Yeah.
Theoretically, is that supposed to be an estimate of power? Like you're saying, we will observe it in 75, but really implicitly it's at 100. It's just that's
exactly. Power. That was the original motivation, was to try to detect signal from noise where we have underpowered samples. And so then, and then that can be expanded, or you can make it 100% or 95% if you want to be more strict. Some people have moved to 51% because with the daily diary data, we don't often have enough time points to obtain significance. And so that's also a problem with using significance as a cutoff, is that's going to be dependent on many things. And so one of them being the length of time. And so so it is trying to get at power to detect. Yeah. Yep.
And I just want to say I'm still, like your quantitative group at UNC, I'm still stuck on the slide where you told us we can infer causation from correlation, so I'm still thinking about the Granger causality.
Oh, Granger causality, yeah. Yeah. Oh, also, I think another thing that I need to stress a little more is Granger causality is a test, and it is a term, but it is not causality in the like Hume, you know, like we don't even ascertain temporal precedence. We don't, so it's not causality in the real world causality sense, it's causality in the statistical sense. And it was first introduced by Granger in 1969. He talked about how you could have contemporaneous causality in this, under this definition, but I should have stressed a little more that I don't mean causality in terms of variable t causes one. It's Granger causes. And so for me, I always use that phrase, Granger causes, because I haven't done anything else. In an experimental design, maybe I can see if causality exists. Like I give you some caffeine and your heart rate goes higher. I might ascertain causality there, but here it's Granger causality, and so it's really just a statistical test rather than actual causality.
So basically you're saying, assuming there's a bidirectional relationship and assuming that there's this autocorrelation for both variables, I can then disentangle the two estimates and compare them to each other.
Yeah.
In magnitude.
Yeah. Knowing that there can be bidirectional Granger causality. Yeah. And yep.
Yeah.
It works from a detecting directionality perspective. And if we think of like just regular, when we do mediation models or when we try to ascertain if one variable's relationship to another variable goes away once we introduce a third variable, it's simply along those lines that maybe variable 1 and variable 2, variable 1 can be predicted by variable 2 in a linear regression, but then once I add in another covariate, that relationship goes away. And so it's just covarying out a very specific thing. Instead of covarying out another variable, it's covarying out the autoregressive effect on itself. Yeah.
One quick
Mm-hmm.
thing. So the group level diagram, is the thickness of the line based on the proportion of individuals?
Yes.
But then the individual diagrams is based on the
Yeah.
strength of relation?
Let me see if I have both. Yeah. Yeah, so I believe I probably have all of that on one slide. Well, they're on two very close slides.
I was just wondering if, like, since it's kind of showing different, like, for instance, say, like, an effect is, like, very consistent, but it's super tiny versus an effect that's, like, you know, super large, but not for everybody. Like, is there a way of kind of disentangling that kind of?
I'd look at a histogram. Yeah. So that's a great question. So here we have proportion. And so the reason why we chose to do it this way for the group level aggregate model is that we could have taken another approach, like for instance, averaged, shown the average weight, for instance, between stress and negative affect. But if half of the people have a negative relationship and half the people have a positive, that's going to be very small and not truly reflective of what's underneath. And so this is trying to show that just people have this relation, but we're making no indication about the weight of it or the sign of it. I think a good example of signs differ meaningfully is within depression. If you look at the symptoms from the DSM, depression can be indicated by weight gain or weight loss. And the same thing with sleep for depression. You can have more sleep or less sleep. And so you might see different relationships between, for instance, sleep, if that's an indicator of depression for you, and stress, for instance. For maybe some people with MDD, major depressive disorder diagnosis, those might be positive, that stress might relate to more sleep because that's a depressive symptom for them. For others, it might have a negative relation, so we wanted to allow for both of those. And then here, the line width relates to the coefficient estimate for this path between the two variables. And I'm not sure the best way to visually combine both of those into one model, or one, and that's why, unfortunately, taking it at kind of a univariate level by taking this specific path for two people, or let's say take a group one, so taking, like, for instance, like stress and negative affect for two people, or across your whole sample, then you can get a distribution of the coefficient estimates and get more at that. And so I almost imagine like little histograms across these, of like what is the distribution for this path that we know was estimated for everybody. Of course, these would all be zero inflated because for most people it's not estimated as a zero. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to do, it sounds like. Yeah. But also, we have, again, a lot of materials, so if anybody has more than 60 time points of data, we are happy to help. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.